The first shots cracked through the cold air like any other battle. Rifles barked. Men flinched. Bodies hit the ground. And then, nothing happened. No screams. No blood soaking into the dirt. No sudden silence that usually follows the first real casualties of a firefight. Soldiers pressed themselves into the earth, hearts hammering, waiting for death to arrive the way it always did. But it didn't. Instead, something deeply wrong began to settle over the battlefield, a feeling far more unsettling than enemy fire, because they were being shot at, and yet, no one was dying. At first, no one questioned it. In war, the mind clings to routine. Bullets fly, you take cover, you return fire. That instinct kicked in automatically. Rifles were raised, triggers were pulled, muzzles flashed. The rhythm of combat took over, but the expected results never came. A soldier felt a sharp udar in his chest and collapsed, convinced his life was over. Seconds passed. He was still breathing. Another man screamed as something struck his helmet, knocking him sideways. When he ripped it off, there was no hole, only a strange dent and a scatter of splinters. Splinters. That was the first whisper that something was wrong. More impacts followed. Bullets slapped against uniforms, ricocheted off packs, struck walls and trees with dull, hollow sounds instead of the cracking violence of live ammunition. Men braced for pain that never arrived. Some even stood up in disbelief, checking themselves for wounds that weren't there. Confusion spread faster than fear ever could. "Are they missing?" Someone shouted. "No, those hit me," another yelled back. "I felt it." A rifle jammed. Then another, and another. Swearing as bolts refused to cycle properly. The guns felt wrong, like they were choking on something they weren't built to fire. Still, no one said the unthinkable out loud, because in battle, there are things you expect, and things you don't even allow yourself to imagine. Enemy fire that doesn't kill sits firmly in the second category. For a brief moment, some thought it might be a trick. Maybe the enemy was testing range. Maybe they were firing warning shots. Maybe this was some strange psychological tactic meant to draw soldiers into the open. But that theory fell apart as impacts continued close, direct, unmistakable. These shots were aimed to kill. They just couldn't. Men began shouting at their officers. Officers shouted back. Orders overlapped, contradicted each other, dissolved into chaos. Someone tried switching magazines. Another grabbed ammo from a fallen comrade. Nothing changed. The battlefield started to feel unreal, like a nightmare where the rules of reality had quietly broken. Then came the moment that tipped confusion into dread. A soldier reached down, picked something up from the dirt, and froze. In his hand was a bullet. Not flattened metal, not a mangled casing. Wood. Light. Splintered. Almost harmless, looking like it belonged in a workshop, not a war zone. For a second, he thought it had to be a joke. Some kind of sick illusion. He rubbed it between his fingers, staring as understanding crawled into his mind. Wooden ammunition was real. Everyone knew that. But it was only ever used for training, never for combat, never for real battles, and never under any circumstances loaded into rifles on the front line. The realization rippled outward as others began finding the same thing. Wooden fragments, jammed rifles clogged with debris, weapons rendered useless at the worst possible moment. This wasn't enemy sabotage. This wasn't a clever tactic. This was something far more terrifying, a catastrophic mistake. And as that truth began to sink in, another question rose above the gunfire, one that made the battlefield suddenly feel very small and very exposed. If their bullets weren't real, what was about to happen when the enemy realized it? Because once that happened, this strange, almost bloodless battle would turn into something else entirely. Wooden bullets were never supposed to leave the training ground. That was the unbreakable rule, one so basic it was rarely even spoken aloud. Live ammunition went to the front. Training rounds stayed far behind it. The two were stored separately, labeled clearly, handled by different officers, and issued under strict oversight. At least, that was how it was supposed to work. The soldiers crouched in the dirt had no time for doctrine or regulations. All they knew was what lay scattered around them: splintered fragments, jammed rifles, and the horrifying certainty that their weapons were lying to them. Training ammunition existed for one reason: safety. Wooden bullets allowed soldiers to practice loading, firing, and cycling their weapons without the lethal risk of live rounds. They were designed to shatter on impact or break apart inside specially modified barrels. In some cases, they were paired with blank cartridges or reduced powder charges. They were crude, disposable, and utterly useless in real combat. And yet here they were, on a real battlefield, against a real enemy, at the exact moment when failure meant death. As panic spread, some soldiers desperately hoped there had been a mix-up in only a few magazines, maybe one crate, maybe one careless mistake. Men tore through their gear, dumping ammunition into the mud, swapping rounds with shaking hands. The results were always the same: wood, wood, more wood. Entire pouches were filled with it. That's when the scale of the disaster began to sink in. This wasn't an isolated error. It wasn't a single careless quartermaster or a mislabeled box. Someone, somewhere along the supply chain, had allowed training ammunition to replace live rounds in quantities large enough to equip entire units. How did that even happen? To understand, you have to step away from the battlefield for a moment, away from the shouting, the gunfire, and the growing dread, and look at the system that fed it. By this point in the war, Nazi logistics were under enormous strain. Factories were rushed, rail lines were bombed, supply depots were relocated constantly to avoid detection. Ammunition of every type, live rounds, blanks, training ammo flowed through the same overwhelmed infrastructure. Crates were stacked in dim warehouses, labels were stamped in haste. Clerks worked double shifts under pressure to move supplies forward as quickly as possible, and in that chaos, distinctions that once mattered began to blur. Training ammunition was supposed to be clearly marked, but markings meant nothing if no one took the time to check. Wooden bullets were lighter, cheaper, and quicker to produce. In moments of desperation, quantity often mattered more than quality. Somewhere between the factory floor and the front line, someone made a decision or failed to make one at all. Maybe crates were swapped during a hurried evacuation. Maybe a depot officer assumed the contents were standard issue. Maybe no one wanted to slow things down by asking questions. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Entire shipments of ammunition reached combat units without anyone firing a single test round. Back on the battlefield, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Rifles weren't just ineffective, they were being destroyed from the inside. Wooden bullets shattered in the barrels, clogging mechanisms, jamming bolts, rendering weapons useless even. By the time the truth fully spread, the battle had crossed a strange and terrifying threshold. It was no longer just a firefight. It was a performance one where both sides were still playing their roles, even though the script had completely fallen apart. Soldiers continued to aim, they continued to fire, and the battlefield continued to answer them with dull thuds, splintered wood, and silence where screams should have been. Some men laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the human mind, when faced with something this wrong, searches desperately for any release. One soldier watched a round strike an enemy's chest and bounce off like a child's toy. The enemy staggered, looked down, then looked back up in disbelief. For a brief, surreal moment, the two men locked eyes across the battlefield, both equally confused about why neither of them was dead. Then, reality crashed back in. Weapons began failing outright. Rifles coughed and jammed, bolts stuck halfway, actions clogged with splinters. Men pounded their weapons against rocks and boots, trying to clear them. Others threw their rifles aside entirely, scrambling for pistols or grenades, anything that still worked. Commands turned frantic. Fix bayonets. Take cover. Cease fire, cease fire. Nothing made sense anymore. The battlefield had become a place where the normal rules of cause and effect no longer applied. You could be shot and survive. You could shoot back and accomplish nothing. Courage, training, and discipline meant far less when your weapon was essentially a prop. And the enemy noticed. At first, they reacted the same way: confusion, hesitation, disbelief. Soldiers who should have been dead were still standing. Hits that should have dropped men in their tracks did nothing. A few enemy soldiers advanced cautiously, half expecting a trap. Then one of them picked up a splintered fragment from the ground. Wood. That was the moment the absurdity ended. Because once the enemy understood what was happening, confusion transformed into opportunity. Advancing soldiers became bolder. Movements that would normally have been suicidal were suddenly safe. They stepped into open ground, testing the fire directed at them, realizing with growing confidence that it couldn't truly harm them. The psychological balance of the battle flipped in an instant. For the soldiers armed with wooden bullets, terror finally took over. Not the sharp fear of incoming fire, but the slow, suffocating dread of being helpless while the enemy closed in. Every second mattered now. Every mistake would be paid for in blood. Some units tried to bluff. They kept firing, hoping noise and aggression would buy them time. Others attempted desperate maneuvers, falling back, regrouping, scavenging ammunition from fallen comrades or abandoned positions. A few even tried using captured enemy weapons, fumbling with unfamiliar mechanisms under fire. There were moments of dark, almost grotesque comedy. A soldier hurled a wooden bullet at an advancing enemy out of sheer frustration. Another smashed his jammed rifle against a wall until the stock split, shouting curses that were swallowed by the chaos. Officers who had spent years drilling precision and obedience now found themselves screaming improvisations, trying to salvage control over a situation no manual had prepared them for. But beneath the absurdity was something far worse. This mistake didn't just neutralize weapons, it erased morale. Soldiers weren't just unarmed, they felt betrayed. Betrayed by the system that sent them forward. Betrayed by the officers who handed them useless ammunition. Betrayed by the idea that preparation and discipline were supposed to matter. The battlefield, once a place of brutal clarity, had become a lesson in vulnerability. And as the enemy advanced with growing confidence, a new realization spread among the men clutching their broken rifles. This wasn't going to end with embarrassment. It was going to end with consequences. Because someone, somewhere, had turned a real battle into a deadly farce, and once the shooting stopped, there would be questions. Questions about responsibility, about competence, about how such a catastrophic failure had been allowed to happen at all. And the answers, when they came, would be just as unsettling as the battle itself. Battles are often remembered as moments of courage or catastrophe, but the truth is that many of them are decided long before the first shot is fired. This one was no different. What happened on that battlefield did not begin with the soldiers crouched in the dirt or the officers shouting contradictory orders. It began far behind the front line, in offices, warehouses, rail yards, and supply depots, places where no bullets flew, but where a single unchecked decision could be just as deadly. The Nazi war machine prided itself on efficiency, precision, and discipline. On paper, its logistics system was a masterpiece. Standardized procedures, detailed records, strict chains of command. Ammunition moved from factories to depots, from depots to rail cars, from rail cars to trucks, and finally, into the hands of frontline units. Every step was supposed to be documented, every crate labeled, every shipment verified. But war has a way of turning perfect systems brittle. By the time this incident occurred, pressure on German logistics was relentless. Production quotas were rushed. Skilled workers were replaced by forced laborers with minimal training. Air raids disrupted transportation schedules. Supplies were moved at night, rerouted repeatedly, and stored wherever space could be found. Under those conditions, mistakes stopped being rare, they became inevitable. Training ammunition, including wooden bullets, was manufactured and stored in large quantities. It looked similar to live ammunition when packed in crates, especially to anyone moving fast or working by dim light. Labels could be misread, stamps could smear, and once a crate was sealed and stacked among hundreds of others, its contents became just another line on a manifest. Somewhere along the chain, verification failed. Maybe a depot officer signed off on a shipment without opening a single box. Maybe a clerk assumed that anything marked rifle ammunition was combat ready. Maybe an inspection was skipped because there wasn't time, or because questioning a shipment would slow everything down and draw unwanted attention. In authoritarian systems, hesitation is dangerous. Asking questions can be interpreted as incompetence, or worse, disloyalty. So people learned to keep things moving. to trust paperwork over reality, to pass responsibility upward or downward and hope the problem wasn't theirs to solve. By the time the crates reached the front, they carried an unspoken assumption. Someone else had already checked, and that assumption was deadly. Frontline officers, exhausted and under pressure, often issued ammunition as soon as it arrived. There was no time for test firing, no spare range to verify performance. The enemy was close. Orders were urgent. Delays were unacceptable. So the crates were opened, magazines were filled, rifles were loaded, and no one noticed until it was far too late. After the battle, the system did what it always does when it fails. It looked for someone to blame. Investigations were launched. Reports were written. Fingers pointed in every direction. Depot staff accused transport units. Transport units blamed factories. Factories blamed rushed quotas and poor materials. Responsibility dissolved as it moved up the chain. Lower-ranking personnel were the easiest targets. They had the least power and the fewest protections. A clerk who mislabeled a crate. A quartermaster who didn't inspect closely enough. An officer who failed to verify his unit's ammunition. But the truth was more uncomfortable. This wasn't the result of one careless individual. It was the outcome of a system that prioritized speed over safety, obedience over judgment, and appearance over reality. A system where everyone assumed someone else was being careful. The soldiers on the battlefield paid the price for that assumption. Some survived, some didn't, but all of them learned the same brutal lesson. The most dangerous failures in war often happen far from the front line, and by the time they're discovered, there's no fixing them. And while reports were filed and blame was quietly assigned, the incident itself began to fade from official memory. Because stories like this don't fit neatly into propaganda. They reveal not enemy brilliance, but internal weakness. Not heroic sacrifice, but preventable error. And for a regime built on the myth of flawless efficiency, that was a truth best left buried. But the consequences of that failure didn't end with paperwork and punishment, because the enemy had witnessed it, and they learned from it. Confusion is dangerous in battle, but clarity can be lethal. Once the opposing forces understood what had happened, the battlefield shifted in ways that no amount of training could have prepared for. At first, the realization crept in slowly. Shots that should have killed didn't. Hits that should have wounded barely slowed anyone down. Men advanced cautiously, testing the fire aimed at them, half expecting the illusion to break at any second. It didn't. Every step forward confirmed the truth. The enemy was firing, but their bullets were useless. That knowledge spread quickly, shouted between squads, passed in hurried gestures, shared in wide-eyed disbelief that hardened into ruthless certainty. What moments earlier had been a stalemate of confusion turned into an overwhelming psychological advantage. The enemy no longer feared the rifles aimed at them, and fear, once gone, changes everything. Soldiers began moving openly. They crossed ground that would normally be death traps. They stood upright instead of crawling. They advanced in tight formations, pressing forward with a confidence that bordered on disbelief. Every second the opposing side hesitated, trying to fix jammed rifles or search for real ammunition, was a second the enemy used to close the distance. The soundscape of the battlefield changed. The sharp crack of incoming fire was replaced by shouts, boots pounding against the earth, and the unmistakable clatter of metal on metal as close combat began. Grenades became devastating. Machine guns still firing, real ammunition dominated positions that rifle fire could no longer suppress. For the soldiers armed with wooden bullets, the terror reached its peak here. They weren't just outgunned, they were exposed. Bluffing no longer worked. Firing back no longer bought time. The enemy had seen through the illusion, and now every advance felt inevitable. Some units tried desperate measures. They scavenged ammunition from the fallen, pried magazines from captured weapons, and redistributed what little live ammo they could find. Others abandoned their positions entirely, retreating under fire, knowing that standing their ground meant certain destruction. In these moments, survival depended less on training and more on improvisation. Small acts of quick thinking made the difference between life and death. A soldier who recognized a captured weapon and knew how to use it. An officer who ordered a retreat early instead of clinging to impossible orders. A squad that moved together instead of panicking and scattering. But not everyone adapted in time. For some, the realization came too late when the enemy was already upon them, when wooden bullets were no longer just useless but laughably inadequate against bayonets, grenades, and automatic fire. The absurdity of the situation evaporated completely, replaced by the raw brutality that war always reclaims in the end. From the enemy's perspective, the encounter was unforgettable. It wasn't just a victory, it was a revelation. Proof that the opposing force, often portrayed as perfectly organized and mechanically efficient, could fail in catastrophic and almost unbelievable ways. It exposed cracks in a system that relied on obedience and speed rather than adaptability and verification. Stories spread quickly among the troops. About a battle where the enemy fired without killing, about rifles that jammed with splinters, about soldiers who should have been dangerous but weren't. Those stories mattered. They shaped expectations in future encounters. They fed confidence. They reinforced the idea that even the most fearsome war machine could be undone by its own mistakes. But for the soldiers who lived through it, the lesson was more personal and far more disturbing. They had learned that survival in war doesn't depend only on courage or skill. It depends on systems working as promised, on unseen hands doing their jobs correctly, on the assumption that when you pull the trigger, the weapon will do what it was designed to do. When that assumption fails, the battlefield becomes something else entirely, and long after the gunfire faded, that realization lingered quiet, corrosive, and impossible to forget. Because the most terrifying enemy isn't always the one charging toward you. Sometimes, it's the failure behind you. When the shooting stopped, the battlefield looked deceptively ordinary. Spent casings littered the ground. Weapons lay abandoned where men had fallen or fled. Smoke drifted lazily in the air, as if nothing unusual had occurred. To an outsider, it could have been any engagement in a long, brutal war. But for those who survived it, this battle never fit cleanly into memory, because it challenged something fundamental, the belief that war, for all its chaos, still follows certain rules, that when systems are built, checked, and enforced, they at least function when lives depend on them. This one didn't. In the days that followed, reports moved up the chain of command, carefully worded, stripped of emotion, facts presented without context, ammunition malfunction, unexpected equipment failure, compromised combat effectiveness. Nowhere did they say what everyone already knew, that entire units had been sent into battle with bullets that could not kill. The official response was swift and quiet. Investigations were conducted behind closed doors. Documentation was classified. Blame was distributed in ways that minimized embarrassment rather than maximized truth. Some individuals were disciplined, others were transferred. A few simply disappeared from records altogether. The incident itself was never meant to become a story. It was inconvenient. It undermined the image of absolute control and efficiency that the regime depended on. Worse, it suggested that the greatest threat to its soldiers wasn't always the enemy but the system meant to support them. So the battle was reduced to a footnote, or omitted entirely. For the men who lived through it, that silence was its own kind of punishment. There were no medals for surviving incompetence, no official recognition for holding the line with useless weapons. Their experience didn't fit into heroic narratives or propaganda reels, and yet it stayed with them. Long after the war, survivors would recall the sound of bullets hitting without killing, the shock of realizing their rifles were lying to them, the moment when confidence collapsed, not because of overwhelming enemy strength, but because trust had been broken. Those memories mattered, even if history tried to ignore them. Because this incident wasn't unique. Wars are filled with stories like this, near disasters, silent failures, catastrophic mistakes that never make it into textbooks, ammunition sent to the wrong place, equipment rushed into service without testing, orders followed without question, even when something felt wrong. Most of the time, those failures are invisible, until they aren't. The battle with wooden bullets is unsettling not because it's strange, but because it's plausible. It reminds us that massive systems fail in small, human ways. A missed inspection, a rushed decision, a label not checked, a question not asked. And when those failures line up, they don't just cause inconvenience, they cost lives. That is why this story lingers. Not as a curiosity or a dark joke, but as a warning. A reminder that in war and in any system built on scale and speed, the most dangerous errors are often the quiet ones. The ones buried in paperwork. The ones dismissed as unlikely. The ones no one wants to talk about afterward. Because if this could happen once, it could happen again. And somewhere, right now, another system is being trusted without question, waiting for the moment when that trust is tested and the consequences can no longer be hidden.